Hello, my name is Dr. Gary Zammit. I'm president and CEO of Clinilabs, a contract research organization that specializes in CNS drug and device development. And with me today is Dr. Justin Brooks, MD, PhD, a neuroscientist, and a scientific advisor to Clinilabs. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Gary. Great to be here. Really excited. Always a pleasure working with you, and really excited to chat about innovative technologies coming up in the sleep domain.
Wonderful. Well, let's begin at the beginning, and let's define medical technology. What is it in the broad sense of the term?
So, Gary, that's a great question. Medical technology really runs a huge gamut, and there's a number of different ways that you can think about the space. On one side, you can think about diagnostics versus treatments, therapeutic type devices. And so on the diagnostic side, a lot of people think about wearable devices that are worn on the wrist, or even like very neat stickers that can go on and look at brain activity, sensors that can go on the legs, skin sensors that can measure sweat and interstitial fluid, and understand sort of a little bit more of the biochemistry that's going on there. When you think about sort of the therapeutic side, people generally think about stimulators. So a lot of nervous system stimulators that might be embedded in the brain or peripheral nerves to reclaim function. You can even have stimulators on the outside of the body that go through that stimulate the vagus nerve and even some muscle stimulation to regain function. So you can think about it in sort of a diagnostic and therapeutic space and treatment sort of spaces. Another way to think about that space is that there's a number of different innovations that are coming to bear now with the advent of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So we can think about great innovations in that. So, looking at electronic health records, looking at software systems, how patient-physician interactions are being mediated by artificial intelligences that are taking volumes of information from many, many patients and trying to individualize that treatment for a given individual by providing clinical decision support or recommendations to the physician or even to the patient, right, when they're outside the clinic. Another sort of dimension of this medical technology space is the innovation on the sensor side and the device side, which is something that's particularly close to my heart. As a biomedical engineer, I like to think about, new devices that we can build with the different technologies that we have, so we can measure accelerations, we can measure voltages, we can measure optical signals, we can measure fluid dynamics. And these, as the materials get better, computational resources get better and smaller, we can start to design new devices and new systems with those devices that really sort of push the boundaries of what's possible when you think about sort of a medical technology. And sort of coupled on that previous point, I think the future and what we're really looking for ultimately, at least in some, specific indications and applications, is, closed loop systems, right? Are we able to sense, then predict what's going to happen and intervene before something bad happens, and moving medicine from more of a reactionary sort of prescriptive kind of a practice to more one that's predictive, anticipatory, and preventing illness. So yeah, I know it was a sort of short question, but it's a huge, really blossoming, really wonderful field to be in.
Yeah. So it's fair to say that med tech is about both devices and data analytics, and it's about diagnostics, treatment, and prevention. There's really a lot there.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
On the diagnostic side, are med tech devices or analytics, are they more biomarkers or are they really capable of rendering a diagnosis or aiding the clinician in diagnosis?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Biomarkers is a really fascinating field in and of itself because, you're sort of in the space of, well, what is a biomarker? And, the FDA has ideas on what biomarkers are, but from a, sort of a 30,000 foot view, you can think of biomarkers as sort of digital or computational signatures of an individual sort of phenotype or sort of indication of what they may have in them. And, sort of very easy things to think about are, could we take an electrocardiogram, which is sort of the electrical signal of the conduction system of the heart. Could people have unique patterns in there that might predict some sort of condition that they may have? And so you can think about, well, if I measure the electrical system in the heart, I can come up with, an equation or a set of equations or some analysis to say, okay, well, based on what we have, the data that we have, we think this person is likely to have this sort of condition. But, as we talked about sort of in that last question, with AI, machine learning really coming to bear, and truly a lot more data resources. It's very true that the amount of data that we can now generate and that we have available to us is much larger. And so this concept of biomarker moves beyond just this idea of, putting a sensor on someone and, drilling into what it might mean, to really thinking about video sources, audio sources, using the electronic medical record, using genetics, laboratory type studies, and actually combining all of those data sources and using a meaningful model to come up with a biomarker that is highly individualized and ideally actionable. We want biomarkers that mean something that we can intervene on and help track a patient's course of disease and sort of improve well-being. And to your second question about, actually becoming a diagnosis, could we generate a machine that somebody walks in and then, they walk out with a diagnosis for a particular disease? I think the time for that will come. I mean, I think there's a lot of hesitation, rightful hesitation on jumping straight into that because, we've had centuries of data of centuries and thousands of years really of people interpreting, talking to patients and interpreting their symptoms and coming up with a diagnosis. And I think we're very comfortable with that sort of model. And I think appropriately, we need to be very judicious in how we might use some of these new technologies to sort of replace some of that core function. And I think, you see some of that now. There's a lot more clinical decision support tools where, a patient takes a test and then it provides it to a clinician or to another healthcare provider and says, hey, this patient may have these issues based on the data that we've got. And then the clinician to ingest that data and then sort of uses their clinical judgment to make a decision. So you see a lot of that now. And I think as technologies get better and as we get through the clinical trials to really highlight and showcase some of these technologies, we might actually get to a point where, diagnoses are rendered almost through biomarkers for a certain set of diseases. There will be a number of things, for example, psychiatry is a particularly difficult field to get a biomarker for and land on a diagnosis. So, I think in some areas it'll be faster than others, but I think that's definitely the future.
It sounds like there's a lot of data integration in med tech. Is that what's called big data? Is that what that means?
Right. This is one of these industry pop terms that you hear about all over the internet, and, nobody has a real solid definition on it. To me, when I think about big data, I think about sheer volume, like sheer size of data. So if you were counting the number of atoms in a mole of an element, right? So Avogadro's number kind of type size data. That's where I really think about, where you're going to need a huge amount of storage and a huge amount of computational resource to process that data, because that's the real limitation, right? Is like we can store a lot of data on a lot of hard drives, but if you need to bring it into a computational sort of memory or be able to access it because you need to look at all of that huge amount of data that you have at once, that's where you're really where the rubber hits the road and where you're really struggling to compute on those data. In terms of data integration, I think that we are getting to a point where that is coming to, where we're getting to that size of data, especially when you start to think about genetic type data or the entire omics type field, right? You can think about if we had, a complete genotype on someone, we had all their phenotypic data, we had ECG data and brain data, all of these types of things. If we had all of that on somebody, on an individual, then yeah, I think you're definitely broaching that idea of a truly big data that's going to test, sort of stress test any sort of computational platform.
As we transition from the use of med tech as biomarkers or as support tools to aid the clinician in diagnosis to actually possibly becoming the diagnostic standard itself, how do we move from there to treatment? You talked about devices that might be treatment devices?
That's a fascinating question. Again, something that's very close to my heart. The way I think about that particular problem is through control systems, and so there's decades of, well, much longer than that. There's years and years and years of research in control systems. Specifically, a lot of it comes from sort of the intellectual backdrop of aerospace engineering, where they're trying to use sensors on the plane to predict what's going to happen next and change the plane's velocity and wings and these types of things. And so I think that that's where that research is going to go, is really thinking, okay, we've got this great biomarker. Now, if we provide this treatment, what are the sequelae from that treatment? And ultimately, build models that say, okay, well, this biomarker is changing this way. We know that if we do this, the biomarker is going to go this way, and sort of set up sort of a what we in the industry call sort of a closed loop control system. And it's a lot of research, and it's I gave sort of the plane analogy there that control systems, were largely developed or thought of a lot in aerospace engineering, but that's a closed system to a large extent, right? We designed the plane. We were able to collect data in wind tunnels and develop the sensors and test all of those things out. The human is much more complex, right? We don't know everything that's there. We don't know all the variables that are important to that control system. So it's going to remain a very long-standing challenge to get to that level of treatment, right? Of this idea of developing the biomarker, developing the device to measure the biomarker, to then develop the treatment is going to take quite a bit of time. But I think it's going to be in sort of that intellectual space of control systems and predictive control.
How many years away are we from that?
Well, the good news is that it exists for some things, right? The closest example I think is probably in diabetes, where there are closed loop pumps that sense and dose insulin appropriately, and they kind of learn their individual and sort of fine tune all the different parameters that need to be fine tuned there to maintain good glucose control in patients. So it exists in some way where I think it's going to be very indication specific. Again, being a neuroscientist and fascinated by things that are almost too complex for us to conceive of, it's harder to think about what that kind of closed loop system might be. What is it that you're going to be sensing to drive changes in a psychiatric condition? And I think it's also going to be there are other sort of ways to think about it. For me, I like to think about the really fast devices that are doing these really beautiful AI algorithms, but there are slower and doing things in real time, like on a second by second basis. But there are other things that we could do, right? We can develop applications, a simple phone app, right, that knows how much you're moving, how much you're walking, can maybe hear your voice or record some video and say, hey, you look very stressed, you look very fatigued. Maybe tonight you should do some yoga or something very, simplistic like that. And so, I think thinking about the indication and the sort of the time scale of what you're trying to intervene on is going to guide sort of the years, where we're moving. But, I will say that, I have a lot of faith in the scientific engine in the United States. I think we'll be moving quickly. I think there's a lot of really bright people here that are really pushing the edge of the envelope. I'm excited to see what they come up with.
I recently read a book by Ray Kurzweil called "The Singularity is Closer Than You Think."
The singularity.
And the singularity referring to a time when humans and machines are kind of fully integrated. And the title of the book, "Closer Than You Think," suggests that these things are going to happen in our lifetimes. Do you see that as well?
It could be the case. I mean, clearly there's a lot of innovation that has been sort of, I won't say earth-shattering, but really has given us pause to think, right? And the most popular example here is ChatGPT. You talk to ChatGPT, it can generate a lot of language that really looks like a human could have written it, and gleans from sort of all the text that it was trained on across the internet and libraries and these types of things. To some degree, that already passes the Turing test, right? It's already harder to tell if that's actually a computer or a conscious being that we're talking to versus not. And so, there are some examples like that. And of course, neither of us really deal in the classified space. There may be some very interesting things that we don't know about sort of as well. But I mean, I think that the biggest enigma the human brain, I still think is probably the most fascinating enigma that we have to contend with, right? I mean, we're almost the only organism that spent its time trying to understand itself, which I think is a beautiful problem in and of itself. But I would say that we have very limited understanding of what's happening in the brain. And while we have, again, I'm a neurosystems neuroscientist, so, I think about these things a lot. While we've uncovered a lot of very interesting patterns and we are able to come up with beautiful treatments like deep brain stimulators and all kinds of different innovative ways to do it, I really think the biggest limitation is understanding how the human brain works on, a second by second, moment by moment level. And I think that'll preclude any sort of cyborg fusion of man and machine in some sort of meaningful way. I mean, does that mean that we won't have robotic or artificial intelligence partners that are almost working with us like a human? And if we think about that as the merging of human and machine, that's probably already happening. In fact, I can say that, some of our military researchers are already looking at how that works. But, to think about, an implant into your brain that's reading your brain signals and understanding that and intervening on your behalf or giving you the compute power of a machine or access to, huge amounts of data. I think we're still a ways out from that. My 2 cents.
You're a physician and neuroscientist. You're also a biomedical engineer. I'm curious about your personal path and what came first. Were you an engineer who got interested in medicine or a physician who got interested in engineering?
Great question. Truthfully, this all came about because I'm really interested in philosophy. And I'm really interested in thinking about consciousness. My college roommates and I, we spent hours, and then in fact, many parties that we had ended in heated philosophical debates about, the theory of mind, the theory of science. But I have always been fascinated by the mind-body interaction and trying to think of, I wanted to think about a math model for consciousness. Like, how can I just write a system of equations, all the way from Hodgkin-Huxley considerations of action potentials all the way through like a behavior. And that's been fascinating for me. That's been fascinating since college. And so when I went to graduate school, I joined the neuroscience program there, and that neuroscience program happened to be embedded within a biomedical engineering department, and that's where I got my flavor of biomedical engineering. Neuroscience, where I went to school at Washington University in St. Louis, the systems neuroscience path was really computationally heavy. It was about understanding how lines and boxes are connected and what it means to send signals and information across those lines and boxes. And so I got really steeped into that knowledge area and sort of grew that a lot. I was very fortunate to work with some really wonderful thesis advisors while I was there that really exposed me to a lot of that and got me maybe that close, much closer to my ideal of having a whole math model of the brain. The physician side of that is sort of a similar story. I am one that really enjoys applied research. I have a lot of basic science colleagues that do absolutely beautiful, fascinating work, but I like the work that I do to be able to be tested in what we say real world conditions and be useful and then translate to the lab. So that's what motivated my desire to do medical school and become a physician as well, is that, if I develop a technology, if I develop an idea, can I see a patient and actually see if I can help that patient feel better? So it all sort of came together, sort of a tortuous course, but really motivated by this idea of this enigmatic brain that we have.
I've had the great pleasure of collaborating with you in a small way on a project that you conceived of, looking at objective data and subjective data in the field of sleep medicine. Can you talk about that project and what your idea was starting out and how you conceived of that?
Absolutely. So, I worked in pharma for a while and saw many clinical trials fail, especially those that had what we call subjective endpoints. And so these are endpoints that, a patient reports, right? So, if a patient is having, if the clinical trials for a new pain medicine, a patient might report, the outcome that is being measured is how much a patient reports that their pain was that day, that week, whatever it might be, however the study is sort of designed. And a number of trials failed using those types of endpoints. And, when you step back and look at the data, you see, variable placebo responses among individuals. You see various treatment responses. And, when you think about that, when I put sort of my psychologist hat on and think about, well, what is it that's happening when somebody reports, fills out a diary or reports how much pain that they are in? When you think about when it comes down to it, there's several sources of non-treatment, so things that aren't related to the drug being tested, and non-disease related that can influence that decision. And we know that, the law is very cognizant of that, of, bias that people have in their memory, biases that people have in their perception. And so when I thought about that problem, I was like, well, how can we improve it? I mean, clearly the patient experience is the most fundamentally important part of any treatment that we develop, right? It's unargued. We can't argue that is the most important point. But the question is, how well are patients really able to tell us what they're experiencing in a truly meaningful way? Not because they're filling out these diaries or filling out their rating because the kids are stressing them out. They didn't sleep well last night. They're arguing with their spouse. That all can influence the number that they give, right? And so what we thought about doing was combining, and I think sleep is an especially important one because, a lot of sleep medicines are developed again through patient report, right? How well did you sleep? How long did you sleep? How long did it take you to fall asleep? Which, quite frankly, on the surface is a little bit ridiculous because it's asking, how long were you unconscious? How long did it take you to become unconscious? When did you stop becoming unconscious? And so that's almost the extreme case of this subjective reporting problem, this diary reporting problem. Again, I want to reiterate that, the patient's experience of sleep is paramount. So no questions there. But, there are these factors that there's this inescapable fact that, asking a person to remember and report these things is influenced. So what we thought to do was, well, hey, look, there's a ton of devices out there that record sleep. There's retail devices, there's cleared devices, a number of different devices that are approved for measuring different aspects of sleep. What if we asked people to fill out the diary, but that we showed them what their device said before they filled it out? And the manipulation there is very simple, right? You're just saying, okay, well, your device says that you slept for 8 hours. How long did you think you slept? But what that does is anchor someone's perception into something objective, something that is repeatable and measurable. And I should say that I think everybody in the field would agree that while, I've enumerated all the problems with sleep diaries, devices have very similar problems, right? They have their own problems, very different problems. If you put a device on somebody's wrist and they just lay still in bed reading a book, that might register as sleep for a device, right? And so there are lots of errors that could generate in terms of the device. But what we thought to do was to combine the two of them together, provide the patient the autonomy to be the final arbiter of what they say, right? They're the ones that will fill the diary out. They will give us what their report is, but provide them sort of this anchoring point that's measured objectively. And as we published, what was fascinating to see, and I think something that you taught me while in the early days of this project was, this idea of mismatch, right? There are people who will say, I only slept 2 hours, but by every measure that we have, it looks like they slept 8 or 9 hours. And we saw a number of those patients, but when you actually showed them their data, they reported longer sleep. And what was really fascinating is that in some of these people, it almost treated an anxiety they had about sleep, and they ended up sleeping longer as measured by the device. So I think, it was a wonderful paper to publish in Behavioral Sleep Medicine. We're continuing to work with the FDA on that technology and think about that as a technology that can help therapeutic developers like yourself get better measurement of sleep and hopefully get treatment to patients faster and more efficiently.
Does that introduce a bias to the patients, though? Let's say you gave them spurious objective data.
Right.
If you told them that they didn't sleep well, or you told them that they really slept well, would that influence then their self-report? So I guess the question is then, how much of a self-report is it?
Right. No, that's a great question, and the answer unashamedly is absolutely right. You could nefariously sort of lie to people and try to get them to change their sort of perception, which could be thought of as a treatment, moving forward. But we'll table that for now. To your direct question, it absolutely could happen and is likely to happen. The question is, where is that delta? Where is that difference between, what actually is measured and what is experienced versus not? Because, let's say that in an extreme case, if I stayed up 24 hours a day, but I, was strapped to the bed, but I was aware of it, and then you reported to me that I slept 8 hours, well, I would just throw that away, and I would just say, yeah, absolutely not. But, where those lines get drawn and where they get fuzzy is an important question, and that's something that we're actually looking at now in a follow-on study to that paper that we published to really get a sense for where does that bias exist, what's the magnitude of that bias, and sort of how do we measure it, and tie it back all the way back to some earlier discussions that we had. We're looking at biomarkers for that, right? We're looking for biomarkers of people that are likely to be influenced by bias versus not, so that we can start to think about, who would be most appropriate for this technology.